lucky here at Muscle Car of the Week that people provide a lot of feedback to the videos that we post, and many times people ask questions. Every once in a while we like to kind of stop down and answer a few of those. One that has come up more than once is a question about the term compression ratio, right? So a lot of times we'll be talking about a particular muscle car and we'll mention the compression ratio of the engine, but I don't know if we've ever gotten into an explanation of what that really means. So the most basic explanation I can give you is that an internal combustion engine requires air, fuel, and spark to run. And if you take gasoline vapor, say for example you had a little spray bottle, like a hairspray bottle, and you sprayed some gasoline vapor into the air and ignited it, it would make a fireball. But to harness more power from that air and fuel gasoline explosion, you compress the fuel and the air. The more you compress it, the more violent the explosion is and the more power you'll make with the car. So inside the engine block, you've got your pistons that move up and down, and they compress that air and fuel so that when the spark plug ignites it, it pushes that piston down, which turns the crank and turns the transmission shaft, turns the drive shaft, turns the rear end, turns the tires, and turns your frown upside down because you're making power. But if you want to show how much that compression is, they came up with what's called the compression ratio, which compares two numbers. So the compression ratio compares the volume of the uncompressed fuel and air mixture to the size of it being compressed. So for simple math, if we're talking about a 2-to-1 ratio, the compressed volume would be 1 and the uncompressed would be 2, which refers to the space in the cylinder with the piston all the way down, I guess down this way. So a 2-to-1 would be this much. A 10-to-1 means the uncompressed space is 10 times bigger than the compressed space. So in effect, the higher that number, the more compressed that air-fuel ratio becomes, that air-fuel mixture, right before it gets ignited, right? You still with me? So in a gasoline engine, especially one that's all made of cast iron parts, like our typical muscle car engines, a compression ratio of 10-to-1, 10.5-to-1, or 11-to-1 is starting to get pretty high. The more you compress that mixture, the higher the performance of the engine to a certain point. If you overcompress it, you lose control of the combustion event, and then you have things that are called detonation and knocking, and that mixture lights off just from the heat and not from the spark. That's bad. That doesn't make power at all. Another thing that's interesting is that cast iron holds on to heat a lot. So you can't put too much compression in it because it makes more heat, and then again you've got those rogue combustion events. So today engines use a lot of aluminum, and aluminum, like in the cylinder head, gives away its heat pretty quickly. So you can actually increase the compression ratio with an aluminum head and make more power because it doesn't hold the heat and light that stuff off on its own. So other things that affect compression are the seal of the rings. The more the rings seal, the more they can compress that air and fuel mixture. When you look at compression, you're also talking about cylinder pressure. So a stock non-high performance engine might have a lower compression ratio, especially back in the early, late 60s, early 70s. Those might have been 8-to-1, 8.5, 9-to-1. A high compression engine being 10, 10.5, 11. Cylinder pressures would be 20 or 30 pounds per square inch higher than a non-performance engine. In the early 70s, all this changed. Compression ratios were reduced because they thought two things: the new fuel that was unleaded had an effect on how they ran, and it also affected the emissions. So a high compression engine in the mid 70s, like in a Corvette, for example, those things were only like 8-to-1. And that reduction in compression also turns into a reduction of power. So there's a lot of things going on with compression and fuel and timing. Another interesting thing is that you can combat unwanted ignition by increasing octane. So for example, if you had a 10-to-1 compression engine, it might run on a 92, 93 octane. If you boost that to 12-to-1, like in a racing engine, you might require 110 octane. And the reason for that is that 110 is actually harder to light than a 93. But that also means it's going to resist igniting on its own. So in a street engine, thinking about the heat and driving in traffic, high compression can become a problem. Race engines, to stay on the Indianapolis 500 or the NASCAR super speedway tracks at 180, 200 miles an hour, they ran high compression, but they also had really high octane fuel to combat that. So that's kind of a long way to describe it, but hopefully that clears up what that term compression ratio really is. And it lets you know that in our videos, that's the reason why we only say, oh, it's 11-to-1, because we didn't get into all this. But great question, and always appreciate answering tech questions on these cars. All right, back to viewer mail for those of you who are still watching. We got a comment on episode 98, Olds 442. It has red inner fender wells, and we said that those red fender wells were an appearance thing, bright red fender wells, which were just there for styling. Actually, they're also functional to a certain degree. They are made of plastic, and the plastic inner fender wells are a little bit lighter than the steel ones, so they help get a little bit of weight off the nose, which was good for acceleration and balancing the car. So that's a good question there. Episode number 325, somebody asked about the 429 engine in the Ford Ranchero that we featured, and they said, is that 429 in the Ranchero the same engine as the Boss 429 found in a Mustang? No, it's close. The bottom of it technically is pretty similar. It's called a Series 385 engine, and the cylinder block and the pistons in design are essentially what was used in the Boss 429 Mustang. The big difference on the Boss is the cylinder heads were a semi-hemispherical design. They're very large valves. So you could take a regular 429 and put the Boss heads on it and cam and intake and stuff and kind of make a Boss, but technically those are two different engines. And last but not least, in a recent episode we featured the Citroen Mist Cuda. Very popular episode with us, interesting car, interesting color, and I put the question out there. The Cuda was what I had thought to be about the only time a manufacturer used a nickname for a car. They shortened Barracuda down to Cuda in the high performance versions. Somebody pointed out that Chevrolet also did that when referring to the Chevy 2s, which was the earlier version of the Nova, and Chevrolet themselves called that a Chevy right on the car, so good observation. So that's all I've got for right now, but we're always happy to answer questions and read the feedback that people leave. So if you've got something, leave us a comment, and we'll be back next time with something else pretty cool from Muscle Car of the Week.